The evening everything changed began with a single sentence. "Could you have your dinner upstairs tonight, Evelyn? We're expecting company, and we'd like a little privacy." The words were spoken politely enough, but they landed with the weight of a slammed door. I stood frozen in the middle of my own kitchen, a knife resting against a ripe tomato I had just picked from the backyard garden. The overhead light reflected off the wooden countertop I had spent weeks restoring years ago after my husband passed away. Every inch of this room carried memories: birthday cakes, Christmas dinners, school lunches, and quiet Sunday mornings with coffee. Without saying a word, I placed the knife beside the cutting board, lifted my plate, and walked toward my bedroom. The hallway felt longer than it ever had before. Inside my room, I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the untouched meal balanced on my lap. The silence wrapped around me until one painful truth finally settled into my heart. Somewhere along the way, I had become a guest inside my own home. My name is Evelyn Carter. I am 68 years old, a retired elementary school teacher, and the sole owner of a modest split-level house in Maple Ridge, a peaceful suburb outside Vancouver. It isn't a luxurious property. The paint needs refreshing every few years. The fence leans slightly after every winter, and the backyard is just large enough for a vegetable garden that has been my pride for nearly 3 decades. But every brick, every window, every flower bed represents years of honest work. My late husband Richard and I bought this house when our son, Adam, was only 3 years old. We spent years paying the mortgage while raising him on 2 ordinary salaries. After Richard died from heart disease 12 years ago, I continued making every payment until the house finally belonged entirely to me. I believed it would always be my safe place. I was wrong. It all began almost 2 years earlier when Adam called one chilly October afternoon. His voice sounded unusually cheerful, the kind of friendliness a parent immediately recognizes as nervousness hidden beneath optimism. He explained that rising rent, childcare expenses, and inflation had stretched their finances beyond what they could manage. He and his wife, Lauren, needed somewhere temporary to stay while they saved enough money for another home. "It'll only be for a few months," he promised. I didn't hesitate. He was my son. I remembered driving him to early morning soccer practice, helping him through difficult exams, comforting him after his first heartbreak, and proudly watching him graduate from university. When your child asks for help, your first instinct isn't calculation. It's love. 3 weeks later, they arrived with a moving truck, dozens of boxes, and my 4-year-old granddaughter, Sophie, whose bright smile could melt away almost any worry. I had already prepared everything. The guest bedroom had fresh bedding. Sophie's room had colorful curtains, storybooks, stuffed animals, and a little wooden step stool beside the bathroom sink so she could brush her teeth by herself. Their first weeks together felt almost perfect. The house was full of laughter again. Sophie chased butterflies through my garden while Adam grilled hamburgers on weekends. Lauren thanked me repeatedly for opening my home to them. I truly believed we were building wonderful memories together. Then the little changes started. At first, they seemed harmless. One morning, I noticed the coffee mugs had been moved to another cabinet. A few days later, my favorite cooking utensils were organized into different drawers. Lauren explained she was simply making the kitchen more practical. I smiled and told myself it wasn't worth mentioning. After all, she cooked more than I did these days. Then my pantry changed. Boxes of pasta, canned vegetables, and homemade preserves that I had carefully arranged were packed into storage bins and carried downstairs. When I asked where everything had gone, Lauren smiled. "The shelves looked crowded," she said. "This makes everything feel cleaner." I nodded, even though something inside me felt strangely unsettled. A week later, I found an old ceramic bread box that had belonged to my grandmother sitting on a dusty shelf in the garage. It wasn't just a bread box. It had survived 3 generations of family dinners. Still, I carried it back inside without saying a word. I convinced myself these were tiny inconveniences. Families compromise. That was what loving people did. Looking back now, I realized those weren't isolated moments. They were the beginning of something much larger. Every small compromise quietly taught everyone, including me, that my preferences mattered a little less than everyone else's. And once that lesson takes root, it grows faster than anyone notices. As autumn faded into winter, the atmosphere inside the house changed so gradually that I barely noticed it at first. The routines that had once belonged to me quietly became someone else's. Lauren preferred cooking dinner late in the evening, often after 8 o'clock. She and Adam treated preparing meals as their special time together, laughing over recipes while Sophie played nearby. I didn't want to interrupt them, so I began eating earlier. At first, it seemed practical. Soon, it became habit. Without anyone directly asking, I stopped using the kitchen during the evenings altogether. The living room slowly followed the same pattern. If they were watching television together, I would carry my tea into the small sitting room beside my bedroom. When friends called, I usually spoke softly from my room instead of the family room where I had once spent countless evenings reading. Little by little, my world inside the house became smaller. By the beginning of spring, I was spending nearly all my time in 3 places: my bedroom, the tiny sitting room, and my garden. Everything else seemed to belong to them. I kept telling myself it was only temporary. Adam was under pressure at work. Lauren was adjusting to raising a young child while managing a full-time job. Sophie needed stability. Whenever a small voice inside me whispered that something wasn't right, I answered it with another excuse. Don't make life harder for them. They're family. This won't last forever. But temporary arrangements have a strange way of becoming permanent when nobody speaks about them. Even my belongings slowly disappeared from sight. Family photographs that had always stood on the fireplace mantel were replaced with framed pictures of Adam, Lauren, and Sophie. My favorite quilt vanished from the living room sofa. The decorative bowl Richard had bought me during our anniversary trip years ago appeared on an upstairs shelf without anyone mentioning it. Nothing had been thrown away. Nothing had been broken. Everything had simply been relocated. One afternoon, I opened a cabinet looking for my old teapot and couldn't find it. After searching for nearly 15 minutes, I discovered it packed inside a box in the basement. Lauren apologized when I mentioned it. I thought you weren't using it anymore. I smiled politely. I still do. She nodded, but neither of us said anything else. That conversation stayed with me for days. Not because of the teapot, because I realized someone else had decided what I no longer needed inside my own house. Summer arrived, bringing warm evenings and ripe vegetables from my garden. Gardening became my escape. The tomatoes flourished that year. So did the cucumbers, peppers, basil, and green beans. Out there, among the flowers and vegetables, nothing had changed. The garden still belonged to me. One afternoon, while tying tomato vines to their supports, I overheard laughter drifting through the kitchen window. Lauren had invited several friends over for lunch. I wasn't upset about the gathering. What surprised me was discovering it only after hearing unfamiliar voices inside the house. No one had thought to mention guests were coming. I stayed outside until everyone left. When I finally went inside, the dishes had been washed, the dining table cleared, and the afternoon had passed as though I hadn't existed. That realization hurt more than I cared to admit. Still, I remained silent. Silence had become easier than confrontation. At least, that's what I believed. The truth was very different. Every time I ignored another uncomfortable moment, I was teaching everyone, including myself, that my feelings could wait, that they mattered less. One evening, Sophie wandered into my room carrying a coloring book. "Grandma," she asked innocently, "why do you stay in here all the time?" Her question caught me completely off guard. "I like it here," I answered. She frowned, "But this is your house." Children often see what adults spend months pretending not to notice. Before I could respond, Lauren called her from downstairs. Sophie hugged me and skipped away. I sat quietly after she left, unable to stop thinking about those simple words. This is your house. Was it? Legally, yes. Emotionally, I wasn't so sure anymore. I had convinced myself that avoiding conflict was kindness, that sacrificing my comfort was generosity. but kindness should never require someone to disappear inside their own life. I didn't understand it then, but I was slowly surrendering more than rooms and furniture. I was surrendering my confidence. And once confidence begins slipping away, reclaiming it becomes far more difficult than anyone imagines. I had no idea that before summer ended, one ordinary evening would finally force me to ask a question I had spent months avoiding. How had I allowed my own home to stop feeling like home? By late August, my home no longer felt familiar. I had settled into a routine that seemed normal on the surface, but left me feeling strangely invisible. I spent mornings tending the garden, afternoons reading in my sitting room, and evenings behind the closed door of my bedroom while the rest of the house carried on without me. I rarely questioned it anymore. Perhaps that was the saddest part. When people adjust to discomfort long enough, it begins to feel ordinary. One warm Thursday afternoon, I harvested the best tomatoes of the season. Their bright red skins glowed in the sunlight, and the fresh scent of basil filled the air as I carried my basket into the kitchen. Cooking had always brought me peace, and that evening I planned nothing elaborate, just tomato sandwiches, a simple salad, and a bowl of homemade soup I had frozen earlier in the year. I placed everything on the counter and began slicing vegetables. The familiar rhythm of the knife against the cutting board reminded me of happier years when Richard and I would prepare dinner together while Adam finished his homework at the kitchen table. For a few precious minutes, it felt like my kitchen again. Then Lauren walked in. She barely glanced at the vegetables before opening the refrigerator. "Oh, Evelyn," she said casually, "my coworker and her husband are coming over tonight." I smiled politely. "That sounds nice." She hesitated before speaking again. "We were hoping you wouldn't mind eating in your room this evening. We'd like dinner to be a little more private." The words were calm. There was no anger, no raised voice, no argument, yet they struck harder than any insult ever could. I looked around the kitchen, the cabinets I had chosen, the hardwood floor Richard and I had installed ourselves one summer, the dining table where generations of birthdays had been celebrated. Every corner held a piece of my life, and yet someone was asking me to leave it. I searched Adam's face. He was standing near the hallway, having heard every word. For one hopeful second, I expected him to speak, to laugh awkwardly and say, "Mom, don't be silly. Of course you're staying." Instead, he lowered his eyes. His silence answered for him. Without saying anything, I placed the knife on the counter, picked up my plate, and walked down the hallway. No one stopped me. No one apologized. The bedroom door closed softly behind me. I switched off the light and sat in the darkness. The untouched dinner grew cold while tears slowly filled my eyes. I wasn't crying because I had been asked to eat alone. I was crying because I finally understood how far things had gone. This hadn't happened overnight. It had happened one small compromise at a time. One rearranged cupboard, one moved photograph, one quiet dinner, one swallowed objection, until eventually, asking me to leave my own kitchen seemed perfectly reasonable. Around midnight, sleep still refused to come. Instead, memories drifted through my mind. I remembered teaching fourth-grade students about confidence and respect. Whenever one child took another's pencil or interrupted someone who was speaking, I encouraged them to use their voice. "People can't know your boundaries if you never express them," I used to say. I had repeated those words for more than 30 years, yet somehow I had forgotten to live by them myself. Near sunrise, I made a cup of tea and carried it onto the back porch. The garden was quiet. Morning dew shimmered on the tomato vines. Birds moved from branch to branch as though nothing in the world had changed. But everything had changed for me. For the first time in months, I stopped asking myself how Lauren had become so comfortable making decisions in my house. Instead, I asked a different question. How had I allowed it? The answer wasn't easy. I loved my son. I wanted peace. I didn't want my granddaughter growing up surrounded by arguments, so every time something made me uncomfortable, I stepped aside. I convinced myself I was protecting my family. In reality, I was slowly abandoning myself. That realization hurt more than anything Lauren had ever said. Later that morning, I called my closest friend, Carol. We had taught together for nearly 20 years and remained close after retirement. I told her everything. She listened quietly until I finished. Then she spoke with the same honesty that had always defined our friendship. "Evelyn," she said firmly, "this isn't about dinner anymore." "I know." "No," she continued gently, "this is about your home, your dignity, and your future. If you don't act now, you'll spend the rest of your life asking permission to live in a house you worked decades to own." Her words settled heavily in my heart. For the first time in many months, I realized I didn't need another excuse. I needed a plan, and before that week was over, I would take the first step toward reclaiming not only my home, but also the confidence I had quietly surrendered. Carol's words stayed with me long after we ended our phone call. For months, I had been telling myself that patience would solve everything. I believed that if I waited quietly, Adam and Lauren would eventually save enough money, move into a new place, and life would naturally return to normal. But normal had disappeared one compromise at a time. Waiting wasn't fixing anything. It was only making it easier for everyone to believe the arrangement worked. The following morning, after finishing my tea, I searched for a local legal advisor who specialized in housing and family property matters. My hands trembled slightly as I dialed the number. Part of me still felt guilty. I wasn't calling to fight my family. I was calling because I no longer knew how to protect myself. The advisor, a calm and patient woman named Monica Hayes, invited me to explain everything from the beginning. She listened without interrupting. I described the late dinners, the moved belongings, the growing feeling that I was no longer welcome in the home I owned. When I finished, she remained silent for a moment before asking one simple question. "Evelyn, what do you want?" No one had asked me that in a very long time. I stared through the office window before answering. "I want my home back. I don't want arguments. I don't want revenge. I simply want to feel comfortable walking into my own kitchen again." Monica smiled kindly. "Then that's exactly where we begin." She explained that allowing family members to stay without clear expectations often created situations that became emotionally complicated. She advised me to establish firm boundaries and provide a written move-out timeline so everyone understood what needed to happen next. Her advice wasn't cruel, it was practical. More importantly, it reminded me that setting boundaries wasn't an act of rejection, it was an act of self-respect. Together, we prepared a formal written notice requesting that Adam and Lauren find another place to live within 90 days. Holding the envelope on my drive home felt strangely heavy, not because of the paper inside, because of everything it represented. That evening, I found Adam sitting alone in the living room after Sophie had gone to bed. For the first time in months, I walked into the room without hesitation and sat in my favorite armchair. His work bag was resting on the seat. I quietly placed it on the floor before sitting down. He noticed. It was only a small gesture, but it reminded both of us that the chair had always belonged there. "So," he said carefully, "what's going on?" I handed him the envelope. He looked confused as he unfolded the papers. His expression slowly changed from curiosity to disbelief. "You talked to a legal advisor?" "I did." "You didn't even speak to me first." I took a slow breath. "Adam, I've been trying to speak without words for almost a year." He looked puzzled. "What does that mean?" "It means every time I stopped using my own living room, every time I ate dinner alone, every time my belongings disappeared into the basement, I was telling you something wasn't right. You just didn't notice." The room became painfully quiet. "I never wanted you to feel that way," he finally whispered. "I know, and that's what makes this even harder." I looked directly into his eyes. "I love you more than you'll ever understand. Nothing written on those pages changes that, but love should never require one person to disappear so someone else can feel comfortable." He lowered his head. "I honestly thought everything was fine." "I know you did, and that's exactly why we're here." For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, he asked the question I had expected. "Do you really want us to leave?" I reached across and gently squeezed his hand. "I want my son to succeed. I want my granddaughter to be happy. But I also want to wake up every morning feeling at home. I've spent too many months pretending those things couldn't exist together." Just then, Lauren walked into the room. She immediately sensed the tension. Adam silently handed her the notice. She read every page before looking at me. For the first time since moving into my house, her confidence disappeared. "I didn't realize you felt this strongly," she said quietly. I answered honestly, "Neither did I." No one raised their voice. There were no accusations, only an uncomfortable truth that could no longer be ignored. The weeks that followed weren't easy. Meals became quieter, conversations became shorter, yet something unexpected also happened. Adam started spending time with me again. Sometimes he joined me in the garden after work. Other mornings he made enough coffee for both of us, just as he used to years earlier. They were small gestures, but they reminded me that beneath all the misunderstandings, he was still my son. And perhaps, for the first time in many months, he was finally beginning to see the loneliness I had been carrying all along. The 90 days passed more quickly than I expected. Although the atmosphere inside the house remained careful, something important had changed. We were finally speaking honestly instead of pretending everything was fine. Adam and Lauren spent evenings searching for rental homes, meeting with real estate agents, and discussing budgets. It wasn't an easy process. Housing costs were still high and suitable places were difficult to find. There were moments when I wondered if they secretly blamed me for everything. Perhaps they did, but I had reached a point where I could no longer carry responsibility for everyone else's feelings while ignoring my own. One Saturday afternoon, Adam knocked gently on my bedroom door. "Mom, do you have a minute?" I looked up from my book. Of course. He sat across from me, looking far more tired than usual. We found a place. For a moment, neither of us spoke. "It isn't perfect," he continued with a faint smile. "It's smaller than we'd hoped, but it's close to Sophie's school, and we can afford it." Relief washed over me, not because they were leaving, because they finally had a future that belonged to them. "When do you move?" 2 weeks, I smiled. "I'm happy for you." He nodded before quietly saying something I never expected to hear. "I'm sorry." The words hung in the air between us. I should have noticed what was happening. I should have asked how you were feeling. I kept thinking you were happy because you never complained. I reached over and took his hand. I didn't complain because I thought staying silent was helping. It wasn't fair to expect you to understand feelings I never expressed. He looked at me with tears forming in his eyes. I still should have seen it. "Maybe," I answered softly. "But families don't grow stronger by deciding who deserves the most blame. They grow stronger when someone finds the courage to change." For the first time in months, we hugged without awkwardness. It felt like getting a piece of my son back. Lauren also changed during those final weeks. One evening, she walked into the kitchen carrying the ceramic bread box that had once been forgotten in the garage. She carefully placed it beside the kettle. "I think this belongs here," she said. I looked at the small painted bird on its lid and smiled. "It does." She hesitated before speaking again. "I'm sorry if I made you feel unwelcome. I honestly thought I was helping organize the house. I didn't realize I was slowly erasing parts of it." I appreciated her honesty. Neither of us pretended the past hadn't happened, but forgiveness doesn't require pretending. Sometimes it simply means choosing not to carry yesterday into tomorrow. Moving day arrived beneath bright September skies. Boxes filled the hallway once again, just as they had nearly 2 years earlier. This time, however, the feeling was completely different. Sophie ran from room to room, hugging everyone she could reach. When she wrapped her little arms around my waist, I knelt beside her. "You'll still visit me, won't you?" I asked. She grinned. "Every weekend if Mommy says yes." I laughed through tears. "My door will always be open." After the moving truck disappeared around the corner, an unfamiliar silence settled over the house. For the first time in many months, I stood completely alone. I slowly walked through every room, the living room, the hallway, the kitchen. Nothing had changed, yet everything felt different. That evening, I roasted a chicken, baked potatoes, and prepared a fresh tomato salad using the final harvest from my garden. I set the dining table with cloth napkins, my favorite dishes, and a single candle. Some people might have considered it too much effort for one person. I considered it a celebration. As I ate beside the open window, a cool autumn breeze drifted through the kitchen carrying the familiar scent of basil and fresh earth. The house felt peaceful again, Not because it was empty, because it no longer felt uncertain. In the weeks that followed, I returned every misplaced item to its proper place. Family photographs stood proudly on the mantel once again. Richard's decorative bowl returned to the coffee table. My grandmother's ceramic bread box rested exactly where it had belonged for decades. Every morning, while making tea, I smiled when I saw it. It reminded me of something I had nearly forgotten. A home is more than walls, furniture, or legal ownership. It is the place where your voice matters. Looking back, I don't believe anyone deliberately tried to take my home away. Instead, we all made small mistakes. Adam assumed I would speak if something was wrong. Lauren mistook my silence for approval, and I confused self-sacrifice with kindness. The greatest lesson wasn't about property. It was about boundaries. Love without boundaries becomes exhaustion. Generosity without limits becomes surrender. Peace achieved by making yourself invisible is not peace at all. Today, my home is full again, not with permanent guests, but with weekend visits, birthday celebrations, holiday dinners, and the joyful laughter of a granddaughter who still calls it Grandma's house. And every evening, when I sit at my own kitchen table with a warm cup of tea, I remember the promise I made to myself. Never again will I shrink to make room in a place I spent a lifetime building, because everyone deserves to feel at home in the place that already belongs to them.